Good morning. I'm going down the road, and I just wanted to say good morning and deliver a special message to you. Uh, Tonight is the new moon, okay, and I do a lot of I do a lot of things by the moon. I'm not an evil witch. I'm a good witch, but if you talk about astrology, you talk about the birth of Jesus, with the star, and in the book of Genesis it actually says God made the moon and the stars also, not at the same time that he made the earth, okay? And he gave it to us for signs and seasons and days and years. So I do things by the moon, and what I do is usually on the full moon, when the moon is full, I release all my burdens. And so this last full moon, I was outside the Empowerment Center where they would only let me stay for a day, and I just put I forgive everyone who has ever wronged me on a piece of paper, and I asked God's forgiveness, and I crumbled it up and I set it on fire while I was watching the full moon. And so this is the new moon. And usually on the new moon, you manifest. You manifest what it is that you want, right? Because the moon is building up. When it's new, you can't see it, right? And then it builds up. And so this is the time to manifest. And a lot of people do both on the new moon and the full moon. They release their burdens and they manifest. It's really up to you. But tonight I'm going to manifest my new life. And part of that has to do with the fact that I have to let this last one go. And I'm still amidst all of this turmoil about trying to get my husband out of jail because he's been wrongfully accused. He's actually been framed again. It's not the first time he's been framed. But I'm here to talk to you a little bit about my snakes, because people have called me an evil witch, and where the story of the snakes came from. I did a video a couple of days ago about my pretty toes and the evil woman at the rest stop who looked down at them. And sure enough, that night, one of my toenails fell off after I did the video. And I knew it was a combination of that evil woman, but also my video, because in the end it was Mrs. Pete. Okay, Mrs. Pete. Because she's the one who told Derek in the beginning, when he saw my toes the first day he met me. My mom says you can tell a whole lot about a woman by the way she takes care of her toes. And when he was and I told you the story about how I had seen a vision of her as a young woman in South Bay. She was picking cotton. And she swore to herself that she would not do that. She would do anything by crook and nail, pledge anything to Satan in order to be able to be influential and powerful. And she was. She was married to a famous PGA golfer, Calvin Peete. And when I talked to her, she claimed to be the woman behind the man. If it weren't for her, he wouldn't have been who he was. She pledged her soul back then. And, South Bay's filled with a bunch of Haitian people, right? On the farms who know voodoo. It's not something that she wouldn't know. And I have no doubt she probably has that in her family history. She was born in the Sears family. But the power of the snakes, and my ex-husband, okay? Because at this point in time, my ex-husband is still chasing me around, and his criminal involvement in his sister's criminal involvement in drug and child sex trafficking is so extensive. If they went to federal prison, they would most certainly get the death penalty. And the truth of the matter is, you can still do evil spell work from federal prison, right? Look at all these mob bosses. They do evil spell work. They still send their hitmen out to people in the real world. That doesn't stop them, And so, you have to understand what motivates people to sell their souls to Satan, okay? And it comes from a poverty of mindset. And it comes from, that saying is very true. Hurt people hurt people. And in the case of my ex-husband and his family, I suspected from the very beginning that his mother sexually abused him. And it wasn't until she got caught sexually abusing her youngest adoptive son that was confirmed for me. And I asked him, I specifically asked him when all of this stuff happened with Randy that they were trying to cover up, did your mother ever sexually abuse you? And before I could finish the sentence, he denied it. And he told me several lies about him being in prison. One was that they called him Preacher Prettyman. He said that he had read his Bible all the way through. And they called him Preacher Prettyman. And I've learned a lot more about his time in prison. You know, he told me this one story about how a guy was trying to grab his ass in line, and he turned around and screamed, you know, better not touch my ass. And I'd always suspected that he was indeed probably raped in prison, but that he was on the down low, and that he secretly hated women because of the abuse of his mother. And I talked to Jean about her mother, and that her mother just said to her point blank that she was a disappointment. She hated her. She was sorry that she was ever born. And, you know, when narcissistic mothers do that, of course, and of course, Deanne knew divination and kitchen witchery, okay? And she taught that to all her daughters and her sons as well, okay? You know, because there's not just black witches, there's black warlocks too, right? And that would cause anybody, you know, the failure to want, and I talked about this with my ex-husband many times, you know, why don't you go see a therapist? And when he was in prison, he did. Because he wouldn't accept and admit that he was the adult in the room, that he did sexually molest his niece. The therapist said, well, then you're wasting my time. I can't help you. And it was the same way, like with Nancy, you know, didn't want to talk about it, and didn't want to admit your role in it and accept your judgment. And because of that, that saying is very true. Hurt people hurt people. The devil sees what your fears are. And in the case of my ex-husband, it was the fear of abandonment, the fear of betrayal by a woman that, you know, that he trusted, that he wanted her love. You know, the story about the M and the ceiling was a story that he told me about how pathetic it was, that he needed that love. And the same holds true for my husband, Derek, and I could see that in his mother. And because I could recognize that, I told him early on to cut her out, how damaging she was to her, because I knew that if he didn't heal from that, if he didn't heal from those wounds and do the shadow work, he would turn out to be just like my ex-husband. And in the end, I was put in my ex-husband's life to turn his life around so that he would make the right decision, but he didn't. He gave in to his fears. And that is how the devil controlled him. And ultimately, they sacrificed me. They offered to sacrifice me to the devil. And that's, you know, that's how they were spiritually lost. And so what is my husband now? I realize, because new levels, new devils. My ex-husband, is really a shell of the man that I knew. It's just a host body for demon spirit. And it's the same way with Mrs. Pete. It's the same way with my sister-in-law, Jean. And that's why they do horrendous things like sacrifice human bodies. There's 4 human bodies that were buried on the property where I was trapped in Buckingham the day I left. And there are more. And so, you know, this is just an extent. And all of the evil people that were involved in this whole thing, they all pledged their souls to the devil. And I'm going to tell you this story because it's about the snakes. And I'm going to give you the cure for spiritual snakebite. And the cure for spiritual snakebite only works if you haven't already pledged your soul to the devil. because I've delivered some spiritual snakes to people. I have. But I'll tell you how it got started, because I did not realize that I had the power to do this, and I only have the power to do this because I don't want to get caught like Moses who struck the rock, okay, being, kept from going into the promised land. It has to do with God, and it has to do with the fact that we were at the Home 2 Suites trying to start our life fresh. Derek was getting some assistance from Centerstone, which, by the way, is a very, very corrupt agency. Okay, I'm going to put that out there. And it just conveniently dried up in the month of July. And it conveniently dried up because of my ex-husband's influence, and a combination of the fact that there were 3 women downstairs practicing black magic. And one of them was a woman named Holly 2 Sampson. And she was just an awful woman. She worked for a Pace Cooper franchise. And she was jealous. She was just that, she was a mean girl. She was a mean girl in school and a mean girl in college. And then she just got fat and became a fat, mean girl. Okay. But she was also a black witch. And there was another woman there named Tanya Aldana. Okay. She, I think she was sort of Hispanic. I met her daughter. I said I would teach her daughter how to play guitar if she wanted. But she was a Trump lover. Okay. She was the one who said, well, that's just, when I talked to her about the Miss Trump lady who stole money out of my purse, she's like, well, that's just a political thing. I'm like, oh, okay. Robbery is a political thing, I guess. And Susie Wilkins, the one whose son finally died, even though we tried to help Dylan. We called the Lee County Sheriff's Office, and I'm not a child snatcher, I don't know who he was. And Jennifer Turner, the one who lied to me about Anastasia's statement and tried to frame Derek as well, were there. We called them, and they said, well, the officer, I'm not a child snatcher, said, I'm not a child snatcher, and so they left. And then we were unceremoniously kicked out of the apartment. But I had noticed things that were going on with witchcraft. And I showed you a picture of Susie Wilkins' altar and the things that were going on upstairs. But in the end, they were evil witches and we were evicted. And Holly pretended to be our friend. Okay. And when the funding for Centerstone dried up, I was actually going with Derek for him to take his driver's test for the 7th time. And this was the make or break. He had to take it. He had to take this test and pass it. Otherwise, he was going to go to jail for driving without a license. And Derek, has a learning disability. And these tests are designed to fail people with learning disabilities. Pure and simple. And so I was helping him with that, and that was my first priority. But what Miss Sampson didn't tell us, me and like 14 other families, was that there was a ball team that was scheduled to be booked in the hotel. And all these families that had lived there were going to be displaced. And so when I was at the driver's place, Holly called, and before I told her I needed to go to the driver's license place. And I was crying because I didn't have any money. People were stealing my money. Centerstone had dried up. I didn't know what it was coming from, but I needed to keep focused on getting Derek his driver's license. And, I said, I don't have any money. They rejected my card. And I looked at her, and I had tears in my eyes. And it was just like Jean with the tissue, where she just handed it to me without just batting an eyelash. She just said, but she smiled. She said, it'll all work out. And sure enough, when I was at the driver's license place, she called and said we needed to move out because the ball team was coming in. And so and then they had, I was furious, right? And so she ended up taking all our stuff out of the room, stealing my underwear, stealing my KY jelly. I think she stole some other items as well. Felipe was talking about that. And I, couldn't afford to do my braids anymore, so I bought some hair, and I tried unsuccessfully to braid my own hair. It was a nightmare. And so she took all this stuff, including the one poncho that I had made, the red crimson sunflowers that I had made a video of, and she just kind of wadded it up, shoved it in a bag. And she shoved my hair in a bag. And, I know because I kept my toenails polished for Derek. She also was jealous of Derek. She was pretending, for number one, she was trying to seduce my husband. But she also had a black husband, and she treated him poorly. I think she stole like $5,000 after I had given her the snakes, and she was giving guys blowjobs in there. She was doing drugs, and in addition to all of her evil spell work. And the necklace, the tourmaline necklace that I had, and this was the first clue I knew she was an evil witch. She refused to wear. She hung it on her lampshade. Okay, and so they dumped all our stuff, including the drum set and everything, in the IT room. And that's when Felipe told us that she had stolen my underwear. Sick. Okay, so we go down there. We have no way of transporting it because we just have this Mustang, right? And so Mrs. P shows up in her sizable SUV, and she's sitting there, and we're trying to get them to release our stuff. And Mrs. Pete is like, well, I've got better things to do. Okay. And you know what? I don't let narcissists manipulate me. And by that time I realized she was a narcissist. And I said, well, if you have other things that are more important than this, Mrs. Pete, then just go. We'll figure out another way to get the stuff. Okay. So eventually we do get the stuff. We finally are able to rent a U-Haul truck, and then we haul it back to the storage unit where the rest of my stuff is. And I'm furious because I know that these women were integral in getting us kicked out of there, specifically Holly Sampson, and I was angry. Okay. When I set up my own, I showed you Susie Wilkins' altar where she was praying to the god Poyle. I was praying to my God. I had pictures of my ancestors, but I had my Bible in the center. And one time I'm praying in my devotional, and then I'm doing my music, and then Derek and I get in this huge fight. And just as we do, all of my candles just go up in flames, and we put it out, and a money candle won't light again. Okay, the money candle won't light, and there's another candle that wouldn't light. And sure enough, our money dried up. And I knew at that moment, the protection candle, I knew at that moment we had enemies around. There was no question. God was saying I had evil enemies around, and they were practicing witchcraft. Of course, Derek didn't believe me at the time. And so I remembered the story that Derek told me when he was in jail. And it was the first day we met, okay? I didn't question him that he had the gift of prophecy, and later on that night, I asked him to explain, and he told me the story about Miss Margaret. And I didn't ask him about this story because I know it was true. Because by that time I realized he had spiritual gifts. And I've understood the extent of those spiritual gifts. Okay. And he told me the story about being in jail. I think he was in the Lee County jail, actually. And there was a black man. He was a Haitian man, and he had dreadlocks. And, if you've been in the county jail, there are some people who get care packages on a regular basis, but then there are other people who don't have anything. And, even if you eat everything, all of the slop on your tray, you're still hungry sometimes. And so this guy was asking for food, and he often did that, ask for food. And there was this racist redneck guy, and the racist redneck guy constantly threatened him. And the Haitian guy said, well, I'm just warning you, leave me alone. You better leave me alone. Well, the Haitian guy goes around and he's begging for food. And the racist white dude gives him a sandwich. And as the Haitian guy is eating the sandwich, the racist redneck dude goes, there's a part of me in there. He had jizzed in the sandwich. And that was enough to trigger this poor man. And so that night, Derek said he watched him. He was sitting on his bed, and he cut off a dreadlock, and it fell to the floor, and it turned into a snake, and it went over to the redneck dude and bit him, and he died. I never questioned that that's what he saw, because Derek said he freaked the fuck out. And so I knew it was possible. I knew it was possible for you to use magic to turn snakes, make things into snakes, right? And I remembered the story about the 10 Commandments. I told you about watching the 10 Commandments with my mom when I wrote the song Better. And how Moses, when he was delivering the children of Israel out of Egypt, had Aaron turn his rod into a snake. And how Pharaoh said, well, my pharaohs can do that. I mean, my sorcerers, evil sorcerers can do that. That's nothing. And so they all turn their rods into snakes. But sure enough, Aaron's snake ate the pharaoh's magician snakes. God's snake killed the devil's snake. And I knew if this voodoo man had the power of the snake, I could have the power of the snake. But I was just praying. Because I was just so overwrought. We had been displaced once again, because that was my ex-husband's goal, was to keep me broke, to keep me homeless, and Derek's mother, his mother too. And I knew we had evil enemies. And so we had relocated all of this stuff into the storage unit. In the storage unit was filled with stuff I didn't want, and filled with stuff that my ex-husband had left behind. He saw no value in. One of them was the Trumpy guy voodoo doll, but this was before the voodoo, before I found the voodoo doll. And so all of our stuff is there, and all of the hair that I had tried to braid on my head was matted up and shoved in this bag. And I'm just furious. I'm crying. I just gotten off the phone with my daughter, and trying to get sympathy for the fact that I been displaced once again. And she said, well, that's what you get when you say you don't care about things. And so I hung up the phone, because I felt like I had done this all for her, giving up my life and making sure that she got a condo where she was safe, because I told her, they're going to kill you if you come down here. And she didn't believe me. And so I pulled out this hair. Okay. And Holly too. She had Derek's, she had Derek's dog. And Xena, she was pretending that Xena was her dog. Okay. and she wanted him. Obviously she wanted him, because he had spiritual gifts. And this is why the devil wants people like us, right? Because we have spiritual gifts. We're human batteries. And so I pull this hair out, and as I'm pulling the hair out, it drags across my big toenail and rips it off. And I'm bleeding profusely. I'm so filled with anger. Because even though Derek actually passed his driver's test, we didn't have $6 to pay for the license. And here we were, and my hair was matted, and I just ripped my toenail off, and I was bleeding profusely. And just as I was doing that, cursing this woman out, he comes around the corner in the storage unit and says, Holly wants to know if you want your hair back. And she had called earlier and asked him if Holly wanted to know if I wanted my KY jelly back. Okay. And that wasn't the last time somebody stole something of mine that was an intimate item. Okay. And I was just filled with rage. And so I had some of these note cards that I had printed that I was trying to sell with photographs of my original art that never got sold. Okay. They were blank note cards. And I had my Bible. And so I did a Bible study. I remembered the story about the snakes. And I prayed. I prayed to God. I said, Lord, if you could turn Aaron's rod into a snake to beat the devil, do that now. I have faith in you. And I read the book of Exodus, where Aaron does that. Is the book of Exodus? Yeah. And then the book of Numbers. The book of Numbers. After Moses delivers the children of Israel out of Egypt, he splits the Red Sea. And then for 40 years they wander around in the desert. He sends down manna. And people wonder, why did they wander around for 40 years? They wandered around for 40 years because some of the people that he delivered out of Egypt didn't deserve to go into the promised land. And Moses was just one of them, okay? Moses was just one of them. And so, the people of Israel are wandering around in the desert. And they're griping and complaining. We're tired of this, man. We want bread and water. But they're griping about other things, and they're sowing seeds of discontent. And finally, Moses and God had enough. And so God sent snakes down. Basically to bite the complainers, the gripers and whiners, and kill them. And that's what they did. He sent snakes down to kill them. And so I'm reading this story. And I'm thinking about the voodoo man, the Haitian guy. Because we had actually told this story to Anthony. The day I was standing in front of him, Anthony was a guy that worked at the Home 2 Suites. And Godfinita's fake daughter-in-law, her son passed away, and she was living with her for a time. She did my box braids, and they were falling out of my hair. She didn't know how to do it right. And so literally, I'm standing there talking to Anthony, and one falls on the floor, and I take a picture. And then I tell Derek that reminds me of the story of the Haitian guy, and the snake, and the dreadlocks. And so Derek tells the story to Anthony. Okay, so Anthony's working there. He's heard the story, right? And so I've got my card, and I write on this card a letter to Holly. And I talk to her about how evil she is and what she has done to us. And I tell her the story about the Haitian guy with the dreadlocks. And I say, I pray, I wish my God would turn this into a snake. I wish my God would turn this into a snake and bite you. That's what it said. I pray. And so I put it in an envelope. I put it in the envelope. I wrote the letter, and I put my braid inside. And I'm like, you know what? That's all I need to do. I just need to get that out and send it to her. And so the next day I get a call, because I had to send it priority mail, and I had to do it in special packaging. And so the next day I get a call, I think from our Officer Martinez. It was a Hispanic name with an M. And he says, did you send a letter to, I'm at the Home 2 Suites with a woman named Holly Sampson. Did you send her a card? Did you send her a card? With something in it, threatening her. And I said, yes, I did. I did, officer. And he says, well, you need to stop harassing her because you're scaring her. And I need you to promise me that you won't do it again. And I said, well, officer, look, I'll promise you that I won't talk to her again. I'll leave her alone if she promises me that she won't try to bed my husband down. And calling him with comments like, I have your KY here. You want to come get it? And he said, oh, well, she agrees to that. And so, I'm like, okay, all right, fine. She got the message. And it was sometime later, like maybe what, that night, I guess, Derek said, I told him, because he had gone down to see Anthony again, because he'd been going down to see Anthony when the rest of the witches weren't there, and he was talking to him. And so he goes down to see Anthony, and Anthony tells him the whole story, which is this ball team that we had been displaced for was all there in the lobby when she opened up the letter. So it was the ball team and Anthony on the cameras in front of the staff. And she opened up the letter, and it turned into, he said, a grass snake, and bit her, and fell to the floor, and Felipe had to chase it out the door. She screamed, and everyone was there to watch it, and it was on the cameras. And so she was one of those ones that didn't die immediately. She had a slow progression to the point where she, started to, that's when she stole the $5,000 from her husband, and, and then she was doing all that other stuff. And finally they put her, my understanding was they put her in a mental institution in Miami area, and either she overdosed or they gave her too much medication, but she ended up dying in the end a couple of months later. It was, it was one of those long drawn out ones, and in the end, that's what it is. When I give people my snakes, I really call upon God's judgment, and he sees everything. So usually what they get is their own bad karma, whatever they wished for someone else. And so that's what she really wished for, probably not just me, but other people. Okay. And so, but at the time I'm thinking, okay, because Derek was telling me these stories about the snakes. He's like, it was all on camera, Okay. And then with regard to Becca, the same thing happened. And I told you the story about Becca. She was a woman that Derek met. Actually, she actually met a woman at the cemetery where his mom was buried in like 2017. And the woman was going around putting flowers on people's graves and praying for them. And Becca was an evil woman. She didn't like that. And so she told her she wished she'd get in an accident. And sure enough, that night she died. And so Becca was just evil. And then she lured him out to the property on Pondell Road with a criminal friend who tried to drag him out and steal $35 because she gave him a picture of an empty refrigerator. She tortured her. She was one of many narcissistic women who had tortured him. In the end, they all got orders of protection, just like Anastasia got orders of protection, but then they'd keep calling, and blackmailing, and, like Jennifer Morello, all of them. And this was a pattern that was encouraged by Derek's mother, okay, because she put them up to it. And so Becca ended up, I was so furious because of what his mother was doing, and his fingernails were falling out. There's another thing too. When we were at the apartments on Deschamps Road, Trinidad Floor, okay, the ones that his mother called us to, and I should have known because there are pinky jeans all over the floor. It was just filled with evil. That Anastasia and Roger and Kayla Moore were all living in that apartment building at the same time. And he had tried to get a job as pressure spraying. And after the second day, he came home because he was having a hard time with his hand even. And I had to take him to the emergency room. And sure enough, his fingernails fell out. Okay. And so we're trying to get a rental car because our tires had been slashed, and his mother's bringing us, all put out that she's going to give us a ride to the bank. And he shows her his fingernails. And instead of looking at them and saying, "Oh my God, son, you need to go to the doctor," she didn't even seem concerned. And this is how it is with abusive narcissistic mothers, and how they damage their children, and why the Bible says that not only Jezebel will be destroyed, but her children will be destroyed, because she will sacrifice them gladly. She didn't even blink twice, and I knew. His fingernails falling out. She was behind that. I knew it. And so Becca was one who, she picked up all of these multicolored braids and brought them in the house. I'm gonna have you Baker acted. Because I called her an evil devil woman. In the end, 3 of those bit her, and she was dead in a couple days. She was outside of Octopharma Plasma, waiting to die. And I could see Derek talking to her, and she was telling him the story, and he came back and he said that's what happened. But I never saw the power of the snake. But yeah, I placed it in faith. I placed it in faith that Derek was telling me the truth. I didn't have to see it. And so when I started setting out these snakes, I was setting them out on people with Trump bumper stickers that were, pissing me off for one reason or another. I can't even tell you. I was like a menace, setting out spiritual snakes left and right. But I did realize, sometimes when you throw them under the wheel, maybe they just get a flat tire. Okay? Because there was a woman, Daryl threw them under one of her wheels. And then she had a Trump bumper sticker, and then sure enough, she's down the road like a mile. She wants him to help her. And he says, who'd you vote for at the election? She says, Trump. And he says, I'm not going to help you. You deserve to have a flat tire. Okay. But it depends on, what it is. And so I placed it all in faith. I said, God, you see what happens? You do with these snakes what you need to do. And so, but one thing I realized when I was doing more of my Bible study about the book of Numbers was that Moses set out these snakes in the wilderness. Okay? And it was biting people, the grumpers, the complainers, the whiners, the ones who were sowing dissent, who didn't deserve to be in the kingdom, who didn't deserve to be considered one of God's chosen people. And so it was killing them. And then the people of Israel were like, oh, Moses, we're afraid of the snakes, And so Moses put a snake on a pole. And he said, anybody who passes by this snake on a pole needs to look at it. And if they get bit by a snake, they pray for redemption and they will be saved. And so I made, my ex-husband had made like a loom kit that I was using to stretch my silk. And so I found a bronze Komihimo snake. And I wrapped it around and I kept it in the Mustang for a while. And even when I planted these snakes, at the luminary, I had it in the back of the Mustang. Of course, we're living out of our Mustang, so it's filled to the hilt. I can't, do anything but sleep with my steering wheel under my knees. Okay. And so Derek's complaining, do we really have to have this here? Do we really have to have this here? And so, but what I had done was, when we finally put it back in the storage unit, was when I realized that the caduceus that you see on the side of ambulances is a picture of a snake on a pole. And that is what Moses used to cure the children who had been bit by these spiritual snakes that God had sent out. And so basically that's how the caduceus came to be, the caduceus on the side of the ambulance. And so still, I had not seen anyone as evidence that these snakes were actually real. Okay. Basing it all in faith, believing everything that Derek is telling me. And so I go into the Hertz Arena. And that night, when we checked in, they said they didn't need our help. I was feeling so bad, I couldn't even get up off the floor. So they called the ambulance and they took me to Coconut Point. And that's where I met this doctor named Dr. Lee. Okay. And so I was talking to him. I asked him specifically, I said, have you seen any snakebite victims that you weren't able to find the snakes or, the anti-venom? And he said, well, we have some anti-venom here. And he said, for such and such and so and so. And he said, what kind of snake are you asking about? And I said, purple braid snakes. And I had a purple braid, a hairband because I can afford to get my hair done. And so I talked to him about the cure for spiritual snakebite in the Bible, in the book of Numbers, was the snake on a pole. And that's when, and then I said, and then it's also the caduceus, the caduceus on the side of the ambulance. So, If you have someone who comes in here with spiritual snakebite, they can stare at that caduceus and pray for redemption, and they will be saved. Okay, that's conditional upon the fact that they haven't already pledged their souls to Satan, because there's no help for that. Okay, and so I think he kind of looked at me like crazy. I was crazy. Okay, and then later on, I saw him again at the end of my stay at Hertz Arena when I had gotten COVID, and he tested me, and he started to talk to me. You know, I was thinking about that cure for spiritual snakebite. And I just sort of changed the subject about COVID. And I noticed that there was a Dr. Lee that had signed up for my TikTok channel some time ago. I think it's probably the same Dr. Lee. He's a Chinese Lee, though. He's not a Korean Lee. We had that discussion, too. And so he was the only one that I had given the cure for spiritual snakebite to. But I didn't know if he was going to use it. In the end, I did give the cure for spiritual snakebite to my husband on the smart mail, jail mail system, because, you know, that is everything that I write is read by someone. Everything that I talk to him about is listened to. And so I wanted people to know that there is a cure for spiritual snakebite. But again, the provision is you haven't already pledged your soul to Satan. And this is how my ex-husband and his sister and Christine P. are really just shells that house the demons that they have given their spirits up to, basically, you know. And so I don't hold them really responsible. It's easy for me to forgive them, because in the end, it's really the devil's doing, because they gave their souls to the devil, because they refused to heal. Hurt people. And, you know, those grumpers and complainers that were in the desert, you know, screaming about why manna wasn't good enough for them, didn't deserve to go into the promised land. And certainly someone who pledges their soul to Satan doesn't deserve to be delivered in the kingdom. You know, we're in the end times. So it's saying my device is too hot and my quality may be reduced, but I have just a little bit more to tell you about cure for spiritual snakebite, because, you know, I've been placing this in faith. All of this about spiritual snakebite, that I had not seen it myself. And, you know, when we were at the point where I was at the Lotus at the Villages Walk, and they were literally driving Derek out of the apartments. And that had to do with my ex-husband and his influence. And my brother as well. Okay. They broke into our apartment. Michelle Johnson broke into our apartment and tried to curse me with my own Bible. In retaliation for a HUD complaint. They made it intentionally hostile. They told Derek he had 7 days to get out. And during that time, he had my dog, Charlie. And he saw, accidentally, his mother, who, you know, by that time I told him not to have anything to do with her. And so she pretended to be sorry, and she wished us the best. And she gave him an awful hug and transferred all of her nasty energy over to him and his destiny over to her. Telling her God talked to her and told her that, you know, she was going to have a heart attack and died if she didn't change her ways. She was just switching her bad destiny with his. And the whole time Charlie was with him, barking at her. And he didn't like her at all, because Charlie has a very good sense of spirit. That's why my enemies don't like Charlie. Like Brian Sutton. Okay, Charlie doesn't like Brian Sutton. And so and he told her the story about our plans to work with caninesforwarriors.org to help vets like forgotten vets like Derek and Charlie, who suffer from PTSD, to heal. And that's when she helped Anastasia Toller set the whole thing up with my ex-husband to bilk us out of $15,000 cash on behalf of caninesforwarriors.org. But when he came home to me, she had transferred all that nastiness onto him. Because again, unhealed, if you are unhealed, those spirits will glom onto you in a heartbeat. All people have to do is shake your hand. That's all they have to do. Touch you, hug you, whatever. And he came home that night and he was a different person. And he looked at me and he started judging me about the evils of tarot. And I knew this wasn't the man that I loved and married. This was not Derek. And then he started to tell me the story about his mother, and I screamed at him. I told you not to let her touch you. And sure enough, a couple of days later, Chantal Ward slammed into him at the intersection of Cleveland and Colonial. And his homeboy, Roger Ludinus, the hitman, who visited me the other day when I called on the devil, just happened to be standing there at the intersection, watching the whole thing go down. And Juliet Scott, the evil voodoo high priestess, came to him and ripped up a $100 bill and threw it at him and cursed him. And David Banning, of the Bannings, who had been Banning crime family, who knew my ex-husband, okay, Richard Banning with Echo Lab, who I think used to work with him, tried to pick me up at Crown Plaza Hotel, okay. David Banning, I'm sorry, I keep saying Banning. Banning is David Banning is the guy from Incredible Hulk, okay. He was the good guy. David Harding, okay, is the bad guy who's been stalking me. He just happened to be there flirting with Chantal Ward, and I think David Harding is actually either the brother or the husband of Angela Harding, who was my ex-husband's illegitimate daughter, whom he sex trafficked. David Harding was there. It was all staged, and it was an insurance fraud scheme. I knew that because that night Derek came to me, and he had gotten the police report because he called me, and I was so mad, and I'm like, just get the police report because it sounds like the police officer is fine, he's being decent. And after Juliet Scott had done that with the torn up $100 bill, it spooked the cop, it spooked the woman who was in the community vehicle, who happened to be Haitian, okay, and told him what had happened. He didn't tell me any of that. I just said, just bring the police report home, because I was dealing with all this HUD stuff, okay. It's no accident. This is all people working together to destroy us. And that night, he was cleaning out his Kia. Of course, he's cantankerous as hell because his mother has transferred all of this evil demonic spirit onto him. And he's cleaning out his Kia, and he comes to me and he's like, something bit me, because I had prayed when he had that exchange with his mother. Lord, I need to see the results. I need to see snakes. At least once. I need to see that your miracles are working. And he complained, something bit me. What was it? I don't know. And so I pull off his buck sock, and on the top of his foot are 2 fang marks. And I say to him, is your tongue swollen? It was obvious. It was a snake bite. He said, no. You feel, can you breathe? Yeah, I can. So he kind of collapsed on the sofa. And so I thought, okay, I need to make sure this is not a real snake that bit him. So I go into his Kia, and I look high and low for my snakes or her snakes. I can't find anything. And so I go back, and I show him, I say, okay, I gave him some tea, and I show him a picture of the caduceus. And I say, you need to look at this, and we need to pray for redemption. We need to pray for forgiveness. And so he just fell into a deep sleep for about a couple hours. And then he woke up about 2, and I gave him some more tea, and I said, when you were at that accident site yesterday, did somebody give you a voodoo curse? And he said, yeah. And that's when he told me about Juliet Scott and the torn up $100 bill. And so that next morning, I went to Juliet Scott's house. I looked on the police report. I found out all the names of the people who were involved in it. And I showed up at her house at 834 Palomino in Lehigh. And it was just this old Haitian woman there. You know, she's got her hair wrapped up, sitting on a lawn chair. And there's a whole bunch of other people sitting on a lawn chair. And they claimed to be a moving company. So I thought, well, I'll just go, because I didn't realize that Juliet Scott, I knew she was the owner of the vehicle, but I didn't realize she was also Chantal's mother, because I did Truth Finder searches on it, and she showed up as her employer. So I wanted Juliet Scott to know that Chantal Ward had slammed into my husband because she was texting, and that she was working for her. Well, I go to see, there's no moving company there. And of course, I'm thinking I'm going to have to move out of my apartments, right? So I'm going to go there and talk to her about potentially moving me. And what I see is this house and a whole bunch of people on lawn chairs sitting in the lawn, in the garage, and there's a bunch of just crushed up tile on both sides. I'm like, this is not a moving company. Okay. And so I talked to her, and I realized that Juliet Scott is Chantal Ward's mother. And she's the evil voodoo high priestess that has been a hired practitioner to take my husband down and me down. And so when they realize that, they say, well, you shouldn't be here. And they all started ganging up on me. And one guy has the sense enough to say to someone who was going to attack me, don't lay any hands on her. And so they chased me back to my purple Jeep. And as I'm driving away, as I'm going back to the purple Jeep, then Juliet Scott tells me that my husband is a pedophile. And she repeats all those vile lies that Jean and my ex-husband and Mrs. Pete were repeating about him. That he was cheating on me. Okay? All right. She was repeating all those vile lies. And as I get in my Jeep and I go down to the end of the road and I come back, Chantal's got me on her cell phone. And she's laughing at me just like an evil witch. And so I stop and I throw a whole bunch of my purple braids out the window. And I say, Lord, if you're going to take one person out, quickly as an example, let it be Juliet Scott. And she laughed at me when I threw those snakes out there. She laughed at me, just like Becca laughed at me when she picked up those snakes. But I know when I set those snakes out, and evil people really are evil, what ends up happening is that God lets them get so careless and sloppy with their breadcrumbs, and they set so many traps that they end up digging deeper and deeper graves for us that they end up burying themselves in. And I called Derek and I said, I told him what I had done. He was so mad because he's like, you need to just plant it in the mailbox. Stick it in the mailbox, like a coward. And I said, no. I needed to know who this woman was. And sure enough, when I was being held in the county jail, Chantal Ward, brought a case in Keith Kyle's court. Okay, Keith Kyle is the son of Judge Kyle. For like $50,000 bodily injury claim. Okay, she looked fine to me. She was holding her cell phone, laughing at me when I threw out the snakes. But she has $50,000 bodily injury claim. And then 2 days later, Roger Ludinus calls in a claim to Allstate Insurance Company. And it turns out that he is... Okay, so back to the story about Juliet Scott. I was interrupted. That was Derek's other public defender, not Mr. Moskovich. This was another public defender. And again, they're trying to assess his competency by asking that the court hire a psychological evaluation. Okay. Again, a licensed psychologist, a mental health counselor, is not qualified to assess whether or not someone suffers from epilepsy. The only person who can do that is a licensed medical doctor, a neurological specialist. Okay. And this is what I've been saying all along, that his mother has kept him trapped in jails and prisons by denying his epilepsy. When his sister actually told me, Angela Henderson told me, that she had adopted him and his brother and his two sisters as a package deal that his grandmother insisted on, and that she was getting extra money for Derek as a special needs child, knowing full well that he suffered from epilepsy and hiding it from everyone. She denied it a year ago. When I told her about my concerns about his neurological state, she said, there is, and I quote, nothing neurologically wrong with that boy. End quote. But back to the snakes. I had seen exactly what had happened to Derek. I saw those 2 fang marks, and that's all I needed to see. And then there was a point where I was raining terror on the Highlands County. And by the way, 8 people who were involved in drug trafficking were arrested last week in Avon Park. And I know they were involved with my ex-husband's drug trafficking cartel and the death of my nephew Rosh on June 17th in 2021. But I had a reign of terror in Sebring. And you would hear me, you might hear me talk about, going to the Starbucks and finding out that my sister-in-law was there using a fake name, really, Regina Falange. And then I go in and say, hey, by the way, do you know that she's involved in the death of her son and her father? Okay. So she's a real murderer, involved in a family-run drug and child sex trafficking ring. And they just looked at me like, okay. But I had visited a family friend by the name of Melody Knapp, and she was actually the one who was working with Joe the day he found that dead body in South Florida. She's been there with the family that long. And she claimed to be, a true friend of Laverne Prettyman's. And they may have had an affair at some point, but she was a lifelong friend that worked for his business. And I went to see her. And I was angry. I had Charlie in the car. She was out there in her little geodesic house. And Charlie was barking at her like crazy. So I knew right then she was an evil woman. And she had always been. But I went up to her and she tried to approach me in the Jeep. And I said, don't come near me. My dog will rip your throat out. And then I walked over to her and I told her about how she had enabled this family who had murdered my father-in-law. And she looked at me and said, well, I never had any problems with you. Okay, so back to Melody. She said, I never had any problems with you. And I always liked you. I always liked you, Lois. And I knew there was really no hope for Melody. Melody didn't have anybody. And, I think she loved Laverne, but she had personality issues. Let me put it that way. The whole family was toxic and dysfunctional, and Melody was just another element in that. And so I left some braids there. She said, what are these? Hair? And I said, yeah, they're snakes. And I was just so angry. I was just so angry that this whole family had literally plotted the murder of their own father. And they were getting away with it. And so I just left him there. And I said, you're probably going to die here and be dead for days before anybody discovers you. I was so angry. And I backed out. And as I was backing out, she took a picture of me with her cell phone. And as I backed out, I pulled out onto the red dirt road there. It was red clay down there in that area. And I saw a snake come from the cow pasture across the road in front of me and head right toward Melody. And it was a black snake. And so I looked up snakes, Florida snakes, and it was like a dark grayish. And dark grayish is actually black cottonmouth. And black cottonmouths are actually poisonous. I don't know if she got bit. But I had it on my dash cam. And so I pulled out my SD card and I said, well, someday I might need to see that. But it was enough for my eyes to see, to know that God was watching my back. And the havoc that I wreaked in Highlands County. I mean, I found addresses of people, places where my sister-in-law stayed. And I left, and then at that point I had Charlie with me. So Charlie was leaving little gifts in bags. And I would just send them over to the Seventh-day Adventist Church that enabled my ex-husband, for 5 years after he was charged as a pedophile. He was on parole for the sexual molestation of his niece. That church allowed him to be a youth group leader. And my sister-in-law, Cheryl, her husband, John McClellan, was an awful man. And his sons and his relatives wreaked havoc on there. Jeremy Kemp was a family friend of the McClellans. He was the one who kept Amanda Mason, I told you about her, who was a child sex slave in Hardy and Polk counties. They all knew each other. And I didn't realize it at the time. I was just believing that I was just trapped in that Roach Motel trying to make the best of my life with my husband, whom I believed was trying to be an upstanding citizen. For 38 years, I had the wool pulled over my eyes. Where else? Oh, the Sebring Masonic Temple. Okay. Where else did I left a whole bunch of snakes all over Highlands County. A whole bunch of snakes. And at one point I was at the, before, on the way back from Arcadia, I was at the Little Theater. I bought a ticket to Laura Wade's play. I was trying to get Pete Pollard to let me do my play. And there was a homeless guy there with his dog trying to plug in. And Tammy Pollard was like, I wonder how much we have to pay in electricity for him to do that. And I looked at her and I said, okay, for one thing, they're all hanging out there on the patio. Nobody wants to see Laura's play because it has holes in it, okay? And I'm telling them about my idea about doing 1-900 Old Ladies right there at Highlands Little Theater for a 40th anniversary. And Pete keeps saying, well, I keep telling you to write a script. And I just get done telling him that I've been homeless for a year and a half because my ex-husband has been chasing me around. And then she says she wonders how much electricity they're having to pay for this guy to plug in his phone. And I looked at her and I said, really? Are you serious? And so I just tore into them. I said, you people have no idea what it's like to be homeless, to be chased around for a year and a half, to be struggling for your life, figuring out where you're going to plug in your phone. What are you going to do with your dog if you have to go into the hospital? You are so self-absorbed. You don't have time to write a fucking script. And I said, I have no intention of doing anything with you people. I will go to New York City and I will get an advance. And I will write a book and leave you out of it. Because this place is a shithole. And Pete Pollard was actually... He was actually the head of the Community Redevelopment Agency. And the last time I'd gone through, I did a video on the Ridgewood Bank, of Barnett Bank, and talked about the failure of the bank and all these empty buildings and how derelict the place looked. And I went down to the Kenilworth Hotel, which was a mainstay. It was beautiful when Britt and I and my other friends were doing our quartets. We'd go in there, we'd sing. We went to Harder Hall. It was beautiful. We'd go in there and sing. And they're all boarded up. And I told him, this is a shithole. I said, I went down to the Kenilworth. It's all boarded up. And Harder Hall, it looks awful. It's shameful. And he's just kind of kicking the dirt. And he says, well, they're fixing it up. And I'm like, and so I left them some snakes. With a card that said, for the cowboy divas and the racist fucks at the Little Theater. And then I went down to, oh, Lake Placid tax office where my cousin Laura worked. Because I knew by that time that my family was stiffing me out of something. They were hiding something. And my cousin Laura also suffers from lupus. And I had said this before. Lupus is just as much a physical disease as it is a spiritual one. And if you're keeping secrets, if people are spiritually attacking you, and that's what happened with my mother, they can kill you with that evil spell work. And by this time, she had lost her youngest daughter. She was taking care of her grandson. And she was walking with assistance. She had a plate on the back of her car so she could park in the handicap parking lot. And I just sat out there in my purple Jeep outside the tax office and beat my horn. I want to make sure they knew. There was some lady out there in a purple Jeep that was beating her. It scared the shit out of her. I think that was my reign of terror on Sebring. And yeah, I left a whole bunch of snakes up there. And I'm glad to see, when I open up my news feed, I don't have to watch the news very long. God shows me what he wants me to see. And last weekend, he showed me that 8 people got arrested by the FBI on a drug sting in Avon Park. And I was also told that the useless fuck lawyer that I hired to defend Derek in Hardy County that ended up dropping our case, she charged me $2,000, okay? And all she would give me was the body cam footage, which she didn't even review. I'm the one who had to do that. So I paid $2,000 for body cam footage. It shows that Officer Rupert stole $400 from my husband. She wouldn't pursue it with the Hardy County Sheriff's Department or the state's attorney's office. And when I asked her, she said, the state's attorney won't agree to that. And I said, did you even talk to them? She said, no, I know they won't agree to that. And so I sent her a picture of the Mustang. And I said, this is what a narcissist will do to you to get rid of you. And I said, so if you want to back out, now is your time to do it. And she just backed out. But in the end, her sister got arrested as well by the FBI. And her day is coming too, because she practiced in Sebring, Highlands, and Hardy County. I know she knew my nephew Rosh because he had a criminal background. And I know she knew and defended several of those people in Avon Park who got arrested by the FBI as well. And she knew of my ex-husband and his cartel. So I think, that's the power of the snake. But by this time, these people have already given their souls to the devil. They've already sold it for one thing or another. And so they're beyond hope. But the snake is powerful. And I'm grateful to God that he gives me that power. And I just let him work his miracles. But there is a cure. And the cure is the caduceus and the power of prayer. Everything in life, especially the story of Exodus, the Exodus is an absolute parallel. Moses delivering the children of Israel out of bondage in Egypt is an exact parallel to the New Testament. We have our own bondage, right? What is our own bondage? Our own bondage is human trafficking, right? It's just modern day slavery. It's how the devil keeps us for human batteries. And God says Jesus is going to deliver us. When the angel of death and the 10th plague was passing over the children of Israel, right? The scary part in the movie, the 10 Commandments, and taking the firstborn, what did the children of Israel do? They painted lamb's blood on the doorposts in anticipation of the Messiah who would come to save them. This is what it's all about. That is the power of the snakes. And for those of you who are capable of being redeemed, who want to be redeemed, that is a cure. And I'm sharing it with you because in the end, the reason why I'm here as a chosen one, the reason why we're all here as chosen ones, is to deliver as many children into God's kingdom as possible. Thank you for joining me. I know this was a long one. But if you come across one of these snakes, at least you now know what the cure is. Have a blessed day.